Good morning and welcome to this webcast. This is, of course, 4 in our series of 4. This is Retaining Educators of Color, Lessons Learned from the Field. I am your host, Jennifer Wicks. Happy to have you on board for this special series and this Friday morning. Please do put your comments and questions into the chat pod throughout the webcast today. We will open it up for Q&A at the very end and look forward to that engagement for sure at that time. And I'd like to introduce you to our facilitator, Dr. Ernest Black, Statewide Director of the Cal State Teach Program at the California State University, Office of the Chancellor. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Black, to get started.
Good morning to everyone and welcome to the fourth webcast in the series entitled Retaining Educators of Color, Lessons Learned from the Field. We will appreciate all the questions that you have, and we will address them at the end of our webcast today. We're so happy that you are here with us, and we hope that we can give you some meaningful strategies for retaining teachers of color and educators of color. We're going to start our webcast today with our partners from CSU Northridge. Dr. John Reveles, Professor of Elementary Education, Dr. Joshua Einhorn, Grants Officer of the College of Education, and Dr. Alberto Ristori, Department Chair, Department of Educational Psychology and Counseling. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yes, greetings. Hi, my name is Dr. John Reveles, and I'm happy to be our team, Josh, Alberto Ristori, Dr. Einhorn. We're all happy to be part of this webcast. We'd like to share some of the lessons we've learned in our Compton Male Teacher of Color Network project that we've developed. So let me go ahead and go through some of that for you. Here's a picture of some of the participants. These are teachers as well as administrators that participated in our Compton Male Teacher of Color Network. Before we get started, though, we'd like to just take a moment of silence to send our thoughts to all those people of color who have been and are still being oppressed in society at this point in time. In this regard, we recognize the importance of our work to help create positive male teacher role models of color for all students who will become the next generation of citizenry. And when we talk about male teachers of color, it's really important to note that male teachers of color include teachers from African American backgrounds, teachers from Latino and Latinx backgrounds, teachers from Asian American backgrounds. So we have all those within our network in the Compton Unified School District. So let me just tell you a little bit about this project and what we've been doing. The project was initially started 2 years ago, and we're entering our third year into the project, working with a collaboration between California State University Northridge, Berkeley, and the Compton Unified School District. So we always had this intention of retention of male teachers of color. And our work in Compton is built on the pioneering work of Dr. Travis Bristol, who has developed similar networks on the East Coast, in New York and in Boston. And so in doing so, Travis and I have worked to create this network within the Compton Unified District. And we've developed curriculum and professional development geared towards helping administrators as well as their male teachers of color within the district. And by doing so, we help them develop tools and practices to address the unique challenges that the male teachers of color as well as the administrators face in their school site and the school district. And these tools have actually helped them develop strategies to navigate the school environment as they participate in our Compton Male Teacher of Color Network. So I want to give you a little bit of background of the project. So we started this project in the fall 2018, spring 2019 academic year. And the project is funded by the California Community Foundation, FEDCO, which is housed within that foundation, and they have funded our project across 3 years. And so we started small. And we did this very intentionally. Travis and I developed this design so that we could slowly scale up because, as we know, real change doesn't occur in a heartbeat. It takes time to develop. And so as we've developed this, we've had this snowball effect. So we started with 8 male teachers of color, 2 administrators, and then in the next year, which was last year, fall 19 to spring 2020, we sought out 8 more male teachers of color because we wanted to double the numbers of participants. And in doing so, we were able to add 3 more teachers from Dominguez High School, which is the main high school where we house the project. And teachers from all over the district came to that high school, and we'd meet there on Saturdays for our PD across the entire academic year. And then we added 3 teachers from feeder schools. So we did that intentionally as well to create a pipeline of success for these male teachers of color. We had a little bit of attrition, and this year we're hoping to double our numbers again. But we are facing challenges of providing virtual PD and virtual. We did have a very successful virtual summit at the end of this past year, this academic year. Now, Dr. Ristori, my colleague, is going to present on organizational capacity building through the CMT, and he's going to talk about how crucial it is to have administrators be a part of this. Thank you.
And I'm Albert Ristori. As my colleague John Ravella said, one of the important components of this project was to include administrators to work with the teachers in terms of the recruitment and retention of males of color. And so one of the benefits that we had during this project was we had a principal, Mr. Blaine Watson, as well as an administrative assistant principal, Mr. Ian Eddy, who were very invested in this project and really worked hard to open the line of communication between the administration and the teachers. And so what the administrators did to promote empowerment and trust between the administrators and the teachers was to work from a leadership approach with the idea of authentic and servant leadership. And in this system, the administrators became vulnerable and were humble and made their decisions with the teachers as opposed to or for the teachers. And so some of the important concepts that were included in this approach were the social-emotional reflection and development. And so during the professional development, this was an important piece of that. Cultural competency, team building was also an important component of the professional developments, coaching and consultation between the teachers and the administrators, and also the idea of teachers observing their peers and receiving coaching from them in their classrooms with regard to best practices in terms of how to work with the students. And so this was done a number of times throughout the course of the school year. And so having both the administrators and the teachers involved in this project did 2 things. One, it helped with the quality of the project, but it also helped with regard to the long-term sustainability of this project after the project is over. The idea is that this would continue on. And so by having the 2 work together in this way, it would promote this idea. So some of the long-term effects of this project, somewhat unexpected actually, were the idea that because the teachers became involved in the leadership of the school, they took on a lot of additional projects voluntarily. So for example, some became chairs of their departments or worked with in terms of coaching and other resources for the school. Some worked with the school board council, and also a couple of the teachers actually went on to pursue their own administrative credentials. So the involvement of the teachers really, and the collaboration between them and the administrators really pushed and promoted this idea of this distributive type of leadership across the campus. And so some of the takeaways that came from this project were an increase in the self-efficacy of veteran and new teachers of color, right? The idea of male teachers of color becoming involved in the leadership of the school, so more of a distributive type of leadership approach. And then what we saw from this was it was very much worth the investment in the human and fiscal resources that were applied to this project. And then so we did the 4 professional developments, and then also we did a virtual summit on May 23rd. And I do want to say that one of the things that happened was this was on Saturday of Memorial Day weekend, and yet we had 59 people attend this, which was pretty amazing, if you ask me, to have this many people from across the country interested enough in the project to come in on a Saturday morning, especially on a long weekend. And so it showcased the benefits of being involved in the type of professional learning communities. And what happened was it got the word out, and it helped us to distribute the best practices that we learned from this project. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Josh Einhorn.
My slide has to do with project sustainability. This project was funded. We received external funding, and it covered 3 calendar years. And so the sustainability is beyond the term of the grant, which is 2022 and beyond. So one best practice that we're using is train the trainer model. Dozens of teachers and administrators were trained, and the training is very rigorous. It spans the entire school year with special emphasis during the summer. So these trained teachers and administrators, once the grant ends, can train future Compton Unified School District staff. The other thing which has been touched on is the organizational capacity. One best practice that we identified was involving the administrators. Oftentimes, PD of this focus is focused just on the teachers. But without the support from the administrators, and I'm talking about principals and assistant principals, and also school district personnel, that's what is needed to garner the buy-in and to instill the sense of belonging and to shift the culture of the school to make it more inclusive. Lastly, we are actively seeking funding to expand this project to other school districts. And one thing I want to share with the participants is project leaders are happy to share the curriculum that's been developed, and other CSUs can use this and work with their local school districts on induction best practices. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Dr. Villas again, and that concludes our slides and our presentation, and we'll be taking questions and answers at the end. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Dr. Edward Rice, Professor of Cal State Teach Program.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to our presentation this morning. And so I want to thank my colleagues for that wonderful introduction and go ahead and get started with my presentation from Cal State Teach on male candidate retention. So many of us have been involved in some of these conversations around teacher retention, specifically around retention of teachers of colors. And one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves this past summer is really, when did you have first a male teacher, and then secondly, when did you have a male teacher of color? So I want to show you a little bit of data on that before I begin. So in 2017, the National Association of Education reported that male teachers only represent 1/4 of the teachers in the U.S. workforce. And to further double down on that, the U.S. Department of Education also reported in 2017 that while African American students comprise about 15% of our public school students, African American teachers were only 7% of the teaching workforce. And even more, I think, alarming was that African American males only represent 2% of the entire teacher education workforce. So one of the questions we begin to ask ourselves is, why is this important? Well, there are several reasons why this is important, and I want to take a minute and highlight just a few of them. But this was important because there are numerous studies that indicate that student performance, teacher perceptions, student outcomes, and student social development are all impacted by a teacher's gender. So here are a few of the key findings from gender-based education research that again suggest the importance of having men in the classroom. I won't read all of these for you, but I do want to highlight number 3 because one of the myths I would say is that male teachers only really impact male students, and that's really a myth that we need to make sure that we dismantle. Because as it notes here, one of the advantages of having more male teachers in the classroom is that the type of intellectual activities and academic interests exhibited and encouraged by men benefit the learning process of girls as well as boys. All right. So I want to talk a little bit now about the strategy that we employed here at Cal State Teach. So in thinking about this, one of the things that we wanted to start to do was to really support our male candidates. We had a problem, like a lot of teacher ed preparation programs, in making sure that our candidates persisted all the way through the program. So what we did was we formed the Men in Education Support Group. And initially, the purpose of the group was to just provide a space for our candidates to discuss some of the challenges that they were having, interact with each other, share ideas and best practices, as well as learn from veteran educators. I should also note that the Cal State Teach program is one of the largest teacher preparation programs in California, and it's also one of the online teacher preparation programs, excuse me. So all of our classes and all of our sessions are conducted virtually and online. So now going back to the male support group, in year 1, 2017, we met monthly online for an hour and we discussed topics such as lesson planning, classroom management, career planning, and financial management. Initially, our goal was just to support our candidates as they persisted through the program and academically. But ultimately, what we began to find out was that there was a social emotional component of the program that the candidates were actually far more interested in. So while some of the long-term benefits of the group were unknown, some of the short-term benefits were apparent to us immediately. Based on a survey of our participants from 2017, all the participants found the group beneficial, and all year 1 participants indicated that they would participate in the group in year 2. And the most encouraging takeaway from our participants is that 100% of them returned to the program in 2017. But there were other takeaways that I'll illuminate on the next slide that began to inform our practice as we move forward. So one of the things that our men began to talk to us about in the group were that they were really struggling with the disciplinary part of the program. When they were placed at the school site, they began to find out that immediately they were put in disciplinary positions. And one of the challenges of that is that, again, these are teacher candidates. So many of them are learning in that moment about classroom management, but yet and still they were expected to, discipline, the students, and especially some of the more troubling students. So that was one. Money was also a big concern. A lot of the men were concerned with, as a teacher, how they would care for their families and financially how they would take care of themselves. One of the other important aspects of the group, again, as I mentioned earlier, it is an online program. So a lot of the men felt isolated at their sites. And so having a group where they could speak about issues that were important to them and that they were experiencing was extremely important. The last piece that we found out was important was that as part of our program, we made sure that we put men in front of them so that they could see other men that were doing many of the same things that they were doing and who had laid out a plan, not necessarily out a plan, but who had laid out a path in education that they could follow, they could emulate, who could be their role model. So it was really important to introduce them to other successful men and veteran educators to help ease their fears about the abilities to have a career in education. So now, what we wanted to do in 2019 is really sort of focus our Men in Education group, and we really began to look at our African American and Latino male candidates. So in 2019, one of the first things we wanted to do was better understand why African American and Latinx males chose our program. So we analyzed 15 of our applicants' responses to the application essay, which was consider the following questions. Why do you want to be a teacher? based on their responses, what we began to find was that one, all their responses had previous experience or encounter with mentoring and or teaching students. And the second finding was that this experience led to a passion and a love for working with students, which appeared to promote a decision to apply to Cal State Teach. That's important to us because what that did, that began to inform us from a recruitment standpoint as to where we need to begin to look specifically for African American and Latino males and better understand what drew them to our program. Not only that, where we could go to find them to get more of these men in our program. Because again, remember, they only represent 2% of the education workforce, and that was something that we wanted to make sure that we changed. So, unfortunately, like I mentioned before, like many other teacher preparation programs, we also realized at Cal State Teach that if we were lucky enough to attract African American and Latin ex-male candidates to the program, we typically had problems or challenges retaining them. So what we did ultimately, we were trying to figure out how we would engage and retain men in our teacher preparation program. So what we did was we decided that this coming fall we are going to apply our approach to our men, specifically to our African American and Latinx male candidates in Cal State Teach, and we want to focus on those individuals because, again, as one of the most vulnerable populations in the education force, it's important to support and make sure that we retain these candidates so that we can not only help diversify the education workforce, but also improve some of the education outcomes for our students. What that will look like, once again, is we will have our sessions and they will focus not only on pedagogy, but also on the social, emotional aspects, even some of the culture aspects, and we'll look at some of the political climate and social climate that we're sending our teachers into so that when they arrive on the campuses and on their school sites, that they are prepared to teach in those environments. And with that, I will go ahead and pass the mic to my colleague, Valita Jones. I will also be available after for questions.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Valita Jones, and I'm the director of the Success Coaching Program at San Marcos University, Cal State San Marcos, which is a new position. I just agreed to accept this role this past summer. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I've been an educator for a number of years, and now I have moved into an educational leadership position, which gives me the ability to look at things from a variety of perspective, a broader perspective. I understand that it's important to be a seeker of truth and wisdom and to bring all the knowledge and information that I've gained to the place of trying to support our educators. So leading and leadership is hard for all those who work in educational leadership, especially when you are trying to support change and transformation in regards to creating equity-minded spaces for educators within a racialized environment. You have to begin to investigate and examine the decisions that are made in regards to supporting educators, the policies that are put in place that either support or hinder them, create barriers, and also the practices. Leading as a person of African descent is even harder. Dr. Wade Noble said, the educational system is doing exactly what it is designed to do and is doing it quite well. So I always have to take pause as an educational leader as I think about how I am going to pursue my goal of supporting educators. One of the primary things that I know that I have to do is I often have to come into these environments and deconstruct, reconstruct, and innovate. What do I mean by that? Traditionally, as educational leaders, we are trained to follow a paradigm that is more colonialize and creates more barriers and prevents the ability to become more equity-minded and inclusive. However, there is a sun on the horizon because we are now moving more towards equity-minded practices, equity-minded curriculum development, equity-minded epistemic ways of teaching, and so I have some hope. I have learned that it is my job as an educational leader to support educators of color with knowledge so that they can learn how to dismantle the systems that they are in and begin to lead critically as they work to educate our children in these environments. We definitely have to stop using these colonialized leadership practices, become more conscious in our leadership practices, and become more innovative. And as an educational leader, my goal, my job, and my role is to support these educators as they try to create more equitable learning environments. So then, what is the role of Black leaders in retaining educators? I want to discuss this because that is my primary experience thus far. Well, initially, being conscious of the fact that you are in a position of power. Often we don't understand that we have power and we have choice. We don't understand, and we have to learn to understand that we can change and transform how Black educators are trained and supported and allowed to practice. We don't have to go with the status quo of how they're trained. We can teach them how to think and ask questions and then support them when they respond accordingly. We have to begin to break the silence, to create space for Black educators to facilitate educational excellence and define what excellence looks like. Embrace the fact that you can create an environment that is equitable, that is inclusive, and promotes excellence, that it's not status quo or routine, and that you're able to explore and develop a more holistic learning environment. Also, you need to commit to the hiring and training of Black educators of color as part of the equity agenda and as a true equity-minded practitioner. And then lastly, develop and support anti-racist policies, practices, and procedures that support Black educators and empower them so that they can infuse Black thought, philosophy, and wisdom into their ways of being, because that's how they become stronger and more solidified in what they do and in the teaching and learning experience. So then, how do we help Black educators understand that they hold vanguard positions that are critical? Well, one of the things that I found to be very beneficial is introducing them to an African-centered framework. You can even use an African-centered framework in regards to educational leadership. I do it all the time. I just don't name it. I use the principles and the concepts and place them in a leadership framework. And it's very much in line with being humanistic, being cooperative, and being collaborative, which is what you need to have an effective learning environment. You can also help them understand that they are essential, not only for African American children, but all children, and that the work they do is valued and valid. Help them to become more self-determined, free, and empowered to usher in changes in their teaching practices. Help them explore, understand, and be comfortable with which type of learning environment they want to create and develop, the type of epistemic practices they want to use so that they can translate the information to students. Inform them of the fact that they are basically healers, a sakusheti. That's what a healer is. Give them permission to embrace their cultural capital, because students come to the classroom with their own cultural capital. And so everyone can be a teacher and a learner in this type of an environment. Provide high quality, equity-minded professional development opportunities. Tap into the collective consciousness, and they can draw from what I would call their spiritual practice, because I think education is a spiritual calling for people. And then help them to understand how to form political consciousness and that their thoughts are grounded in African wisdom. That will help get them through. So just a couple of thoughts in regards to being an educational leader, supporting educators, is recognize that, Black educators and all educators of colors work, and the work that they do. celebrate them for adding equity-minded curriculum, pedagogical practices, and classroom practices. Assist that Black educators are connecting, and establishing positive and learning environments, and use them as an example to other educators to mimic that and facilitate a better learning environment. Restoration is key for not only Black educators, but all educators of colors. They need to rejuvenate. They need to re-empower themselves so that they bring their best self into the classroom. So encourage things, such as meditation, yoga, and any other affirming opportunities. And then understand that reciprocity is the key and most critical element for supporting Black educators. Education only works if we understand that each one teach one. So what I know to be true is that in order to support educators of colors, we must remember that choice is our real power as educational leaders, and that within our sphere of influence, we can create change and have an impact that can be transformational, not only for our educators, but the people or the students that they educate as well. So I'd like to invite everyone to decide you are going to accept responsibility for everything that happens. Become more purposeful, more intentional, more accountable and responsible, and see how fast things change for you. I will be around afterwards to answer questions. Thank you very much for your time. I'd like to introduce Dr. Kirkwood, who is the Regional Director of Cal State Teach.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, and indeed, education is a spiritual calling. Again, my name is Dr. Kirkwood, and allow me to introduce my dear friend, Dr. David Sandals. Far too often, teacher preparation programs envision a world where there is greater representation of teacher colors. Yet, we often fail to inform our teacher prep candidates that parent engagement is essential to their success as teachers. Fundamentally speaking, if you are teaching children of color, Black children in particular, then Black family engagement will lead to retaining teachers of color. Dr. Sandals will begin the presentation by first providing the background to our study, then transition to share what the literature says about Black family engagement. I will then conclude by providing the implications for engaging Black families. Dr. Sandals, the floor is yours.
With our aggregate of 35 plus years of K-12 experience, Dr. Kirkwood and I conferred, compared our existing experiences, and leveraged the resources available via the literature. And what we found unequivocally is that institutions' K-12 spaces are largely challenged to effectively engage Black families. And just for good measure, I want to provide a definition of what engagement means as opposed to involvement. According to Baker, Wise, Kelly, and Skiba, 2016, engaging families, family engagement, refers to listening to what parents think, dream about, and worry about. So with that, we want to give some attention to the challenges that have surfaced concerning engaging meaningfully those families. And largely, one of the reasons that comes to mind and that comes from the literature speaks to the distrust that Black families typically have for institutions at large. There are a host of reasons for this, but namely, there are some challenges regarding the respect of Black family values, and oftentimes schools represent values that run counter to those that are had by it. Now, these challenges are oftentimes exacerbated in general. They're specifically exacerbated as it relates to COVID-19. Our communication is largely limited to computer access, and in some cases, many Black families don't have access. And so this places the onus oftentimes on Black parents to engage in the ways that schools believe they should, But truthfully, these parents oftentimes lack the confidence and the cachet to do so effectively. So the onus is unfairly shifted oftentimes, further widening the picture of this. Additionally, I want to leverage my own experience here and talk about my K-12, prodigious K-12 experience. I was in the K-12 sector for 19 years. And one of the things I've gleaned, and probably this is true for many of you who have K-12 experience, is that we oftentimes hear these narratives, these injurious narratives that abound regarding our families, namely those who are underserved, sometimes Black and Latino families. We hear narratives such as they don't care about their children, they're disinterested, or they're unconcerned, etc. These narratives are oftentimes erroneous. And unfortunately, they abound, as I mentioned. So these narratives, again, further disenfranchise families and continue that rift that divides and the families they serve. So moving further, many families, as a result of all of these aforementioned issues, they've chosen to remove themselves and their children from oftentimes hostile spaces in favor of more helpful environments. So many parents have elected to homeschool. Many parents have elected to use online schooling options to expose their students in, again, the nurturing environments they believe their children are deserving of. So as it relates to the literature speaks specifically to the idea that parent engagement has to be reframed, reconceptualized away from, again, parent involvement to something more engaging of the hearts and minds of families. So it leverages the terminology family engagement as opposed to family involvement, and talks about how families and schools alike have to reconstruct their conception of what engagement looks like. As opposed to viewing things through a Eurocentric lens, it's important to center the experiences of the students we serve, namely the Black students, and an appreciation for what they offer, an assets-rich approach as opposed to a oriented approach. And I want to speak lastly to the bottom section, which is leveraging the terminology that some of you may not be familiar with. It's an acronym. It's called AAVE, or AAVE. AAVE. AAVE speaks to African American Vernacular English. And Jones, in 2015, talked about the importance of valuing AAVE in school spaces as opposed to deriding it and denouncing it. And what it does when we do that in school spaces, when we denounce the language of some of our students and some of our families, we widen that gap further disenfranchising schools and leading to oftentimes an exodus of teachers who are frustrated with all the myriad challenges therein. So with that, I want to weigh and defer to my colleague once again, Dr. Kirkwood, who's going to speak to you about Patience for Action.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. Implications for actions. If we are going to increase the representation and even retention of teachers of colors, then as educational leaders, we must first hold Black family engagement in the highest regard, recognizing that it is essential to provide equitable educational attainment and opportunities for Black youth. Secondly, if we are to advance notions of equity and access for teachers of colors, we must offer up a different formula for clinical practices. So as we're offering and encouraging our candidates to conduct their clinical experiences in diverse communities, we must also tell them about the importance of home visits, about the importance of informing their parents of best practices to support their students. And we must inform future teachers that parental engagement is nuanced, meaning that the white construct is not the only construct of parent engagement. And then we must also understand that community-based educational opportunities are essential to the learning paradigm of students of color. Next, we must delineate between family involvement and family engagement. So as Dr. Sandals just shared, family engagement gets at the heart of the parent, whereas parent involvement oftentimes is something that we ascribe to as a tangible physical placement in school site settings. Next, we have to lift up the voices of Black families who have held their children's educational experience in the highest regard, but were dissuaded or prevented from sustained engagement. There is unfortunately a long-standing experience of Black families being discouraged from entering, from being involved, engaged in their child's learning experience, from the front desk to the classroom to the administrative office. We must be intentional about deconstructing that paradigm and offering up a new platform to engage parent engagement. Next up, we have to explore Black family engagement with sensitivity, understanding of cultural nuances, and a healthy appreciation for the historical trauma that Black families have experienced. The trauma meaning that as school children, in their K-12 experience, they experience a cultural dissonance between teacher and themselves as students, between administrators and themselves as students. And so that trauma carries on as they become parents. And so that dissonance that they experience as students often is led to, often leads to them distancing themselves from their families and schools. Next up, understand best practices in developing greater cohesion between schools and Black families. Although there is a short supply of literature regarding engaging Black families, there is enough evidence to provide best practices to develop greater engagement with Black families. And then the last two, create interdependent communal bonds with schools. And then finally, develop empathy in dealing with disenfranchised communities. Next up, I'm going to bring my colleague, Dr. Taquan Stewart.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Kirkwood. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to share this virtual stage with so many folks that are doing wonderful, wonderful work in various arenas concerning the retention of non-white teachers. My presentation today, some people would call me somewhat of a contrarian, but the title of my presentation is very specific and comes from a very heartfelt place. The title being, "That Don't Make 'Em Biscuits, Some Cats Will Never Teach." This title comes from a quote by Malik Shabazz, or Malcolm X, and that quote is, "They tell us we are citizens, that we are born in this country. Well, a cat can have kittens in the oven, but that doesn't make them biscuits." So our students can attend the same educational institutions, but that doesn't make them white students. Talking Black teacher retention is like creating the narrative that dark people are criminals to justify locking them up for profit, or continuously reminding the American public that there is an educational achievement gap while conveniently never mentioning America's role in creating the gap. I see Black male teachers in a similar fashion. We talk about the lack of Black male teachers, but we conveniently leave out why they do not or may not teach. Before we get going, there must be a charge to educators, teachers, staff, paraprofessionals, administrators, teacher prep educators. First, we have to refuse to let whiteness be used as power. Access, entry, admittance, matriculation, in particular programs and institutions. Next, we have to make a truly concerted effort to get more Black males interested in teaching, which I'll talk a little bit about later. We must also consider what happens to Black males from the time they enter preschool. If you look at what Dr. Kirkwood and Sandals presented, we also must look at what has happened to black males historically. Some may argue that this is most important, but we must acknowledge that racism breeds and is maintained by violence. Whether that violence is symbolic or physical, we have to recognize that, and we have to recognize that education often is at the seat of oppression. Let's do some framing first. Before students even enter schools, blacks are approximately 13% of America's population and have less than 3% of its wealth. Black males overall, 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police. Blacks are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. Black men are over 40% of the prison population. So we have to consider how our students are affected before they even reach us in pre-K 12 settings. Between 2010 and 2012, black males were 21 times more likely to be killed by police than whites. If we look at Kunjufu's work Encountering Conspiracy to Destroy Black Males and the 4th grade slump or slide, right now, all of the black males that we face are in that age range between 8 and 10. And if we talk about lethal and non-lethal shows of force, it's greatly magnified. In schools, to continue this framing, we're operating at a different frequency. Black students make up 19% of all students enrolled in preschool, but yet they are 47% of suspensions. They're 3.5 times more likely to receive out-of-school suspensions in preschool. They're almost 4 times more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension K through 12. They're almost 2.5 times more likely to be subjected to school-related arrest. As much as one suspension can severely, decrease the likelihood of graduation, high school graduation, and the bias and messages that students receive that are sent by educational professionals inform these students that they're not welcome in these educational spaces. Don't like to give quotes that are too long, but I have to present this one from Bettina Love. That intangible violence towards black children is less visceral and seemingly less tragic than the physical acts of murder at the hands of white mobs, kidnapping and killing by white self-appointed vigilantes, or shootings by police officers in their homes and streets. But a slow death, a death of the spirit, is a death that is built on racism and intended to humiliate, reduce, and destroy. Racism is indelible to the black body and the spirit, and the physical and spirit murdering of black bodies is unfortunately part and parcel of America's history. It is in many ways what makes America, America. It is in many ways what makes schooling, schooling. So why aren't black males interested in teaching? Black males are reluctant to exchange their identity for educational advancement in a lot of cases and employment in a world that has historically discriminated against them. Some solutions. So these are not the most tightly thought out, but from my experiences, pre-K through 16, and my personal experiences as an educator, these are some things that I've found to work. And if people want to dedicate the time and really recognize the importance and creative genius of black males, they can begin to implement. So framing the solutions first. two quotes I think really frame, there's many, but these two definitely resonate with me a little bit more than others that I've looked at. First, by Kendi: the only thing wrong with black people is they think there's something wrong with black people. And the only thing wrong with white people is that they think nothing's wrong with white people. The next quote, by Jane Elliott: white people's number one freedom in the United States of America is the freedom to be totally ignorant to those who are other than white. And these quotes can frame the solutions as we move forward. The idea of social emotional learning. So what we have to do is refuse packaged interventions for our students. So SEL needs to be SEL, or social emotional learning, should incorporate culturally responsive and sustaining practices that affirm black students. Must affirm their culture, their speech, customs, norms, value orientations, and we must allow them to move and operate in the ways in which they are socialized to make meaning, or their ways of being, meaning that we must also be able to tolerate, accept, respect, and affirm their righteous indignation and the way they express their outrage. Social emotional learning devoid of any culturally affirming practices is not SEL at all. Second, we should take a healing center perspective. I borrow from Sean Jin right here in Hope and Healing. We have to prioritize, plan for, and encourage the creative genius or the brilliant ways that black males show up. We have to remind black males that they are not their trauma. We have to honor the ways that they dream, that they imagine, they hope, that they grow. Their ways of being. We have to let boys be boys. We have to let them be boys. Laugh loud, talk loud, dance, sing, play. And I say even roughhousing because roughhousing is often a way to cement connectedness in communities. Anti-racist therapy. So teaching is a difficult practice, right? I often call myself a practitioner, not a teacher. I don't necessarily care for the term teacher. But teaching is difficult. I saw in the chat self-care, some talk of self-care. It's very important. And to be quite frankly, after the peculiar institution that has so much defined our country, we all need therapy. White teachers need a particular type of therapy. I lean on Matthias and White Emotionalities and D'Angelo and White Fragility, in that they have to unlearn what they think they know. The why, many of our students' traumas are a direct result of the oppressive systems and our ideologies. Education is one of those systems. Also, why is that white teachers have a different task, and they must first win the fight regarding racism within themselves. Another quote I like by Jane Elliott, it says, if you're white, born in America, educated in America, if you're not racist, it's a miracle. It doesn't mean that anybody is to blame unless they refuse to self-excavate and understand how their positionality biases their epistemology. How? Teachers need meaningful professional development for understanding inequities and to confront them. Culturally responsive teaching, culturally sustaining pedagogy, a humanizing pedagogy, a decolonizing pedagogy, a abolitionist teaching, anti-racist engagement should be a way of life. This is not just about reading a book over the summer or because you have to read it during PE or because you may have to ask questions. We have to be entrenched in this lifestyle, in this way of life. Where does this therapy take place? Pre-service programs, schools, in the literature that we read. We might not be able to read as many novels anymore if we're really trying to make change. In our communities, delve into the communities in which we teach. Don't drive in and drive out. In our personal lives, right? Broaden our circles so that we learn more. Self-excavation. I mentioned how our positionality biases our epistemology. We have to understand the cultural and historical backdrop of that positioning. We do not, or you do not have to own the original crime, but, and here I'm talking to white educators, you must own how you continue to benefit from that original crime. You don't have to own the original crime, but you must own how you move forward and taking very aggressive and necessary steps to undo the crime. Those different pedagogies and practices that I mentioned on the previous slide. And we have to make demands. If we're truly bout it, to quote Master P, we have to make demands. In our pre-service programs, we have to demand that content is provided around framing our identities and allowing us to facilitate our self-excavation, understanding who we really are and picking apart our identities before we enter into school sites, or as we're there in school sites. We have to demand that a justice-oriented thread is woven throughout our programs, not equity, but beyond equity, justice. At our respective school sites, we have to make demands also. That same framing of identities, that self-excavation. We have to push for restorative practices. We have to expose students to Black educators on a regular basis. That starts with trying to get Black male teachers on your campus as best possible. Demand, if it's not happening already, a justice-oriented stream of professional development that's woven throughout the curriculum in the program. Again, not just equity, but justice. We have to spend time in the communities within which we go in to teach. We have to dig up the funds of knowledge. We have to practice a culturally sustaining pedagogy or humanizing pedagogy. We have to begin to see children and families as ethnographers. They are the experts. We have to understand what they bring in, not just their trauma, but their creative genius, their soul that's created against that catastrophic backdrop of that historical trauma. We have to do those things. I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm going to have to turn over to Dr. Black for our Q&A. Thank you, and vote in November.
Okay, thank you to all of our presenters who were remarkable today, and I think we probably could have gone another hour and still not gotten as much information as we need to get for the rest of the day. So there were some questions in the chat that went back and forth between the question writer and those that they were trying to get a hold of. So I know some of those questions were answered, but we have a few more questions that need an answer. So we'll start with Dr. Stewart, if you could come back on the screen, please, and we'll ask a couple of questions for you. And I'm going to start with the last question and work my way backwards. So the CSU received $135,000 to sponsor scholarships across 3 CSUs in 2018 and 19 from the Young Males of Color Fund. Okay. 36 of those scholarships for $5,000 each were dispensed, but it was very difficult. It was a struggle to find students to accept the scholarship. Any advice for the future when we have additional funding from external funders around funding for men of color?
Frankly, I can't really answer the question because I don't know what the struggle was to find those students or the struggle for students to accept the scholarships. I don't know what the impediment was. However, one thing we have to recognize is our affinity towards education. If we don't address that, there are going to be some students that are going to be reluctant to accept or are not going to be seen when you're searching for them to provide these monies. Now, I got to go back to the involvement versus engagement. Giving money without engagement is never going to be successful. And I'll just end that response there.
And you quoted a few very important people in your presentation. Can you explain what is spirit murder?
So I would recommend everyone to read We Want to Do More Than Survive by Bettina Love. She borrows spirit murder, or the term spirit murder that was coined by legal scholar Patricia Williams, and she translates that to, or transfers that to an educational context. So Patricia Williams coined that term in the 80s, and she coined the term spirit murdering to make the argument that racism is more than just physical pain, that it also robs people of their humanity, of their dignity, and it leaves these scars that are more than just personal, but psychological and spiritual, and therefore racism ends up being traumatic. And as long as students feel threatened, it would be difficult to engage them. And so the loss of always feeling threatened, which is a loss of safety, not feeling that they're nurtured and have their basic needs and that they're accepted, are all things that children need to succeed in education.
Could we also say that same thing for teacher candidates? Is it possible that they also feel that when they come to our programs?
Most definitely.
And my last question, Dr. Stewart, and excuse me if I'm taking too much time, you were just riveting here. I had my mouth open the whole time you were speaking. What does one do if a school site does not offer the support needed to support Black students?
Call me. Nah, I would say you could, but I would say find mentors. Find student mentors first, so you can really tap into what students feel that they need, so they can feel what's missing. If you talk to students, students will be most critical of the educational spaces in which we're attempting to educate them. Find parents as mentors, so you can really know what parents want for their children. And you will often find, as Dr. Kirkwood and Dr. Sanders stated, that they have the highest of expectations for their children, and they want the most for them. Because they don't necessarily know, not all of them, because some don't necessarily know how to advocate for their children in order to fulfill those expectations, doesn't mean that that's not what they want. Also, I would find individuals that are familiar with the history of that community, right? So again, not the history of Black people, the history of that community, right? Because you have to look at it as a local level context. We can't paint all communities with broad brushstrokes. So find mentors, that would be my thing. Students, parents, and then someone who is a pivotal individual in the community.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart.
Thank you,
Our team from CSUN, thank you. Our team from CSUN spoke very empathetically about their program, but there are a few questions that we have there as well. The first one being, you mentioned an attrition rate. How much attrition have you experienced so far with your program?
Yes. What do you? Oh, well, there was when we recruit new participants in year 2, we went and looked specifically for teachers of color that would be good candidates for participation in the Compton Male Teacher of Color Network. And so we did it by word of mouth. We talked to teachers, and in any study, in any project, you're going to have attrition rates. We all know that as researchers in educational researchers and administrators. However, we only lost one teacher. So that's what I meant by attrition rate.
You decide to include administrators in your professional development as part of this project as well.
Okay, thank you for that question, Dr. Black. One of the things I'd like to say before I answer is I think a lot of these presentations are interrelated, and the work that we're all doing is very important to be change agents, right? We're making change at different levels, at the school site levels with parental teacher engagement, within the recruitment of male teachers of color in our various CSUs, and the work we're doing at the school district and beyond. So the reason we included administrators is because with any endeavor, any professional development, any research project where you're working in tandem with school sites and collaborating with universities, if you start changing practices with the teachers and you don't inform, engage, and include administrators, you oftentimes run into walls. And I'll give you a perfect example. In my own academic travels, I wouldn't be where I'm at if I didn't have the support of administrators. Specifically, right now, we're getting a lot of support at CSUN from our dean, Sherry Tarvar-Barian, who's very passionate and inspirational in the work we're doing and encourages myself and my colleagues, and Marquita Granat-Shire at the CSU level. So if you have that engagement from the top down, doesn't mean they have to do all the work. It just means they need to be informed and engaged of what you're doing. And so we've taken that model and utilized it in Compton. We have engaged with the superintendent, with administrators, and so on and so forth. And that has turned out to be a very key piece of our success, is engaging the administrators.
And how did you convince if you had to convince the administrators, how did you convince the administrators in Compton that this was in their best interest?
Well, as we all know, we're in education, and administrators are overwhelmed with work. But one of the things that we did, and I want to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Ristori, to also build on this answer, is that we started to make the case and help them understand that it is in their best interest to have administrators participate, because it's their school site and their district, and if they're out of the loop, then they're misinformed and often can lead to problems. Also, by retaining more male teachers of color in their school site and district, it's beneficial fiscally because it's budget breaking to constantly rehire new teachers. And so I'll leave it right there, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Alberto Ristori.
And so what my colleague Dr. Reveles talked about is this notion of a shared leadership. And one of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier was the teachers were hungry to become leaders in their schools, and not just in the schools, but in their whole community and in the schools. And so we talked about some of the teachers becoming involved at the school board level, which is more district-wide, in the schools themselves in terms of becoming chairs of their respective departments, but also to become administrators themselves, that they could take that skill set beyond Compton. So that there was, it really was kind of unexpected, was this hunger by teachers to become leaders. And it was amazing that almost all of the teachers became involved in some form of leadership, either in the district, at the district level, or beyond that. So I think that was an important part. The other thing that John talked about was this notion of how that type of leadership translates into the bottom line, so to speak, in terms of fiscal awareness and how that helps the district itself. So that was a big component of it, and how the teachers felt comfortable working with the administrators to move their practices forward. It doesn't happen, really. I don't think this is nearly as successful as it would have been without the involvement of those administrators.
Thank you, Dr. Astori. And Dr. Valita Jones spoke about educational leadership, so that kind of filters into that. Dr. Jones, if you're available, can you join? We have a few questions for you. Thank you, Dr. Jones. How do educational leaders support Black educators in a silo environment?
Okay, yes. I have a couple of thoughts about that. As I mentioned during my presentation, education is a very vanguard position and it's spiritual work. And Black educators specifically are light workers, but they're light workers who work in a communal environment. So as an educational leader, one of my roles would be to hire more Black educators so that they can form communities of practice, they can create learning environments that thrive and support their construct and way of being. The other thing that I would suggest is, as a educational leader, I fine-tune my skill set as a trustworthy elder. That means that I mentor and I coach them and help them to solidify their teaching identity, and that it is grounded within the cultural framework of wisdom, so that they can learn how to translate and interpret the information to their students. I think it's important for us to empower them and coach them to become subject matter experts, so that they are capable of creating an ecosystem of teaching and learning that respects the teaching and learning process, where creativity and innovation and dynamic stimulation is happening, so that we can create models of change and transformation from the classroom all the way up to the systemic level as far as administration. And then we have to grow our educators to be teachers, learners, scholars, help them to understand the system that they're in and navigate it successfully without giving up their integrity and their sense of trustworthiness.
Thank you. Dr. Jones, you spoke with the spirit. Dr. Stewart spoke with the spirit. How much spirit is needed to either create or sustain or retain Black teachers and Black leaders in our school systems?
A lifetime of spirit. It is very, when you are touching the heart of people and you're doing this, this work, and you're doing it with purpose and with integrity, in a sense of conviction, every day you get up, you have to affirm yourself. You have to do some things that are going to be restorative, so that you can continue to do the work, because we are within an alien framework, and this framework is very detrimental to our soul. So it's not humanistic at all, the position that we've been put in, and we have to become conscious of that, and then we have to begin to work to create a sustainability practice, a way of filling our cup back up once we become empty. Every day I come home from work and I have to find a way to rejuvenate myself in some form or fashion, whether I burn sage at the end of the day or listen to some music. So you have to have a big cup.
I thought that was just me. Who needed to. In order to do what you just described, what kind of professional development do educational leaders need?
So we have to remember that the human mind is a master of building barriers. So we all have to take the position of being in a growth mindset. And we also have to remember that, it's not easy. There's a phrase that I like to say, it's not easy. One cannot dance with ease in a borrowed rap. So that means that I have to broaden my knowledge, my content, my understanding. So professional development that crosses discipline barriers is important. I should learn what engineering is and what they do and how they do what they do, because there can be some value in the practice, the epistemic practices, and what I'm doing as an educator in the classroom. I should understand educational psychology because it's important for me to understand cognition and what role cognition plays in the development of curriculum and translating and interpreting information. So that's something that's very critical. We should also understand that, again, have different types of professional development that not only talk about how do we do our job, but how do we self-sustain? How do we learn self-mastery? How do we learn self-care? Because if we're all broken, what do we have to give? So those are some of the things that I think are important in regards to professional development, not just the basic things. And send your people to different conferences. I go to all types of conferences. Like one of my favorite is NCORE, National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in Higher Education. Just the fact that you're in this space with all of these people who are doctor this and doctor that. The first time I went, and I was like, oh wow, all these people look like me, they have doctorates, and they're talking about a menu of different ideas and concepts. That alone stimulated me, and when I came back, you're ready to go. You're ready to be innovative and to do something different.
Thanks, Dr. Jones. I'm going to have to reach out to you about that conference. I've never heard of it before. I'm going to bring Dr. Sandals and Dr. Kirkwood back on screen if you can, and just one brief question for you gentlemen. When you talked about family engagement, and clearly we know that in many Black communities, brown communities as well, the family engagement is next to none, which of course leads itself, as Dr. Stewart was saying, to why Black men don't want to become teachers. They were never engaged in that space. Is there a difference that you're seeing in family engagement after COVID or during COVID than we saw pre-COVID?
Dr. Sandals, I'll let you take the lead, and then I'll follow up.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to invoke the words of the Honorable Coretta Scott King, who talked about how violence takes many different forms. I'm going to read directly her quote. She says, "I must remind you that starving a child is violence, neglecting a school child is violence, punishing a mother and her family is violence, discrimination against a working man is violence, ghetto housing is violence, ignoring medical needs is violence, contempt for poverty is violence." I'm going to be audacious enough to extend on the words of the great Coretta Scott King, and say that ignoring the SEL component, social emotional learning component of family engagement, is absolute violence. Not honoring the entirety of children and their makeup and their families is violence. And so with that, the distinctions in pre-COVID and proper the engagement, rather, is, in my mind, paramount is engagement and relationship building during COVID. It is absolutely essential, and the literature on the subject of family engagement bears this out, but it certainly bears repeating under this new context. It is vital that we leverage the relationships not just with the student, but with the entire family, so as to provide an encloaked environment of learning and trust, fostering that relationship building that we spoke about during our presentation. But in addition, let me add, failing to engage families, I mean meaningfully engage, meaning hearts, minds, interests, everything. Failing to engage them in favor of curriculum inclusions is an exercise of futility, and it's ultimately going to lead to failure. So I would really urge everyone, practitioners, teacher educators, everyone, to really nurture your development of social emotional learning, what it means. There are 5 main dimensions according to CASEL, the collaborative of social emotional learning. And so I always forget one, so I'm going to hesitate to mention all 5 right now. But chief among those, in my mind, is social awareness. So really important that you engage families meaningfully in ways that are germane and interesting to them, primarily. I'll stop there.
Dr. Black, in short, this is an opportunity for us as educational leaders to seize the opportunity to work with families. Because of the first time in quite some time, we are teaching students in their homes. We are a guest in their homes. And so rather than seeing this as a crisis, we can seize this moment as an opportunity to truly intentionally invite parents into the learning process, really engaging them, ascertaining what their needs are, understanding their circumstances and predicaments, and then really understanding how we can come alongside to partner with them in building this experience out to a robust platform of parent engagement and involvement. So hopefully education prep programs are understanding the opportunity and seizing the moment and really working firsthand with parents, as Dr. Stewart said, community leaders, really tapping into these resources and building a foundation of engagement so that we can continue to support students, and then ultimately this will lead to teacher retention and engagement.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending our webcast today, and our participants and our presenters. Thank you for your wealth of knowledge and your expertise, and for your inspiration, and for correcting our spirits and getting our minds right as we move forward in this new academic year that is a little bit different than any academic year that we've seen before. We did not get a chance to speak with Dr. Rice, but if you have any questions about that program that he was speaking about with the Cal State Teach program, you can feel free to reach out to him by email or me as well, and we can talk to you about that a little bit more. Thank you for your time this morning, and we appreciate you, and have a great weekend.
Dr. Black, I want to thank you very much for facilitating this important webcast this morning, and again, thank all of our excellent presenters for, as Dr. Greno-Shire was saying in the chat pod, just for the deep analysis, thoughtful analysis. She says, you make the CSU proud, so I just want to echo that, and thank you for participants, all the excellent participation in this series brought to you this summer by Educator Preparation and Public School Programs. With that, we want to wish you a wonderful rest of the day. We will have the recording available. We'll be sending that out afterward. Thank you also to Donnie Aguinaldo and Kayla Perez for assistance and support behind the scenes today. And I want to wish you a wonderful weekend. Thank you, everyone.